Be here with you guys. I spend much of my week and much of my life involved with people that are doing the very things that you are doing and what you're learning about here this week. And so thank you for the opportunity to be here with you. Like I said, my name is David, but have you ever experienced a time where there's been some confusion about your identity? Have you ever experienced a time when somebody thought you were somebody else and kind of confused about your identity? And I grew up in the Dallas, Texas area. When I first went off to college, I went to Texas Tech University, and one of the first guys that I met, my very first friend at Texas Tech, was a guy by the name of Rock Robinson. And Rock was a wrestler. He was a state champion in high school, and Rock was big and strong, built like a rock, thus his name, Rock Robinson. And Rock and I became very best friends, so much so that when I graduated from Texas Tech, asked him to be the best man in our wedding, but his mom actually said no. It wouldn't be right for a black man to be the best man in a white man's wedding. And so that was kind of our early years of friendship. But as good of friends as Rock and I were, the first 2 years of our friendship, Rock was actually mistaken as to who I was. And for some reason, when I first met Rock and he first met me, he thought my name was John, but it's not. My name is David. And by the time I realized that Rock was calling me John, then it was just it was awkward at that point to correct him. And so for almost 2 years, Rock would call me John, and I never corrected him. And then one day, Rock and I were both in a student government meeting, and there were about 10 people in the room. And to that point, whenever I'd heard Rock say John, I just automatically kind of turned and looked. But we were in a room with about 10 other people, and they were going around the table just kind of handing out assignments as to what each person was to do. And so when they were working their way around the table, they began talking about what role David ought to play. And so Rock actually stops the meeting, and he says, "Who is David? I mean, who are we talking about here?" And so sheepishly, I had to say, "Well, that would be me." And he said, "Why in the world did you let me go 2 years calling you John and not ever kind of correct this?" And there was some confusion about my identity. At LCBC, we have a group called Pastor's Prayer Partners, and before every weekend gathering, there's about 50 guys that are part of Pastor's Prayer Partners, but they're broken down into small groups of 4 or 5. And so before every weekend gathering, a group of 4 or 5 will show up to pray with me or whoever happens to be speaking before that gathering. And one particular group of this 4 or 5, 3 of the guys happen to be named David. And so every time this group would get together, I would say, isn't this amazing? There's 6 of us here. 4 of us are named David. What are the odds? And I would just make a big deal about this all the time, and went on for about a year. And one of the guys I would see around the church, and I'd say, "Hello, David," every time. His wife actually became part of our church staff working in kid ministry. And I would constantly call him David. And so then it came time for a baptism gathering, and David was going to be baptized. And the way we do baptism is we would clear out a bunch of chairs here in the auditorium. We put up a big swimming pool, and they walk down into the water. And to help me, as I'm standing in the water to greet them, they put the name tag so I'll know who's coming into the water. And so as David comes into the water, his name tag doesn't say David, it actually says Mike. And so in front of everybody, I say, "Why did they put Mike there? It's David." And he said, "Well, no, actually it is Mike." And so I said, "Why did you wait for 2,000 people here to tell me that I'm wrong?" And it was a case of mistaken identity. Now, identity is very important. It's important for us as individuals. It's also important for organizations as well. I mean, you can't run a successful organization unless you know why you uniquely exist as an organization. I mean, identity is important. And in an organization, the way we address the whole identity issue is we ask the question, what business are you in? What business are you in anyway? Why do we even exist as an organization? And you can't run a successful organization unless you know what business you are in. Now, you and I are part of an organization that we call a church. And every week in my church, every week in your church, we spend countless hours preparing for the weekend gatherings. And you may call yours a worship service, we call ours gatherings, but week in and week out, teams of people will work and they will plan and they'll prepare to fill that 11 o'clock hour whenever you gather together with the best possible worship experience for everybody who happens to be in attendance. I mean, that's just kind of our jobs. That's what you do, that's what I do, and so we plan, we prepare to pull off what we hope is going to be a great event every single weekend. But let me just ask you, as you and your team are preparing for that weekend gathering, as your lighting technicians are preparing the lights, or as your sound technicians are preparing all the audio equipment, or as your video people are just kind of shooting different scenes or editing, or as your worship leaders are picking the right songs, do you know, or do you think any of them know what business you're even in? Does anybody ever stop to say, okay, why is this weekend gathering, why are we even doing this? Why do we even exist as an organization on the weekends? And when it comes to the 11 o'clock hour, whenever you meet on the weekend, do you ever stop and ask the question, okay, wait a minute, let's just kind of ask the question, what business are we in here anyway? Why are we doing what we're doing? What are we trying to accomplish? I mean, with all the time that you and your teams are spending, what are we trying to accomplish? And you do it every single weekend, 52 weekends a year, but do you know why? Do you ever ask the question, what business are you in? What are we trying to accomplish? And even if you could come up with an answer, do you think the other people on your team could answer that question as well? When I first came to LCBC about 22 years ago, there were about 150 people, and my first 3 to 5 years at LCBC were spent just trying to answer that one very question: why in the world do we even exist? Well, why are we even here? I mean, what business are we in anyway? I have 2 children they're young adults now, but when they were 5 or 6, they both played a few seasons of soccer, and I don't know if you've ever watched 5 and 6-year-olds play soccer or not, but I mean, 5 and 6-year-olds, every player on the team, I mean, essentially all they do is they just run and chase the ball. And so you just see this mob running all around the field, and there's lots of thrashing of legs and lots of energy and huffing and puffing, but rarely do they ever score a goal. Because they don't seem to understand at that point that the business that they're in is to put the ball into the net, and so they don't understand the purpose of soccer. There's lots of activity, there's lots of thrashing, kicking going on, but very few goals are ever scored. And my guess is that in a lot of our churches, there's a lot of thrashing going on. There's a lot of energy that's being expended. There's a lot of just huffing and puffing and kind of moving all around, but are we ever scoring any goals? Do we really know what business we're in? And what's the purpose of what we do on the weekend? Now, for us as a church, let me just tell you why we think we exist on the weekend. And we believe that every person is on a journey. And we believe the Bible says all of us are on a journey, and this journey is kind of racing us towards eternity. And no 2 journeys are the same. I mean, there's lots of ups and downs on our journeys, but the Bible says all of us are racing towards eternity. And as we race towards eternity, we say as a church, we exist to answer 2 questions. As you are on your journey racing towards eternity, what are you going to do about eternity? Because it's coming. And so what are you going to do about eternity? But the second thing we try to answer is, in light of eternity, what are we going to do about today? How do we live our lives today? What does God say about eternity? What does God say about doing life well today? And so to help answer these questions, for us, when we plan our gatherings, we kind of talk about what story do we want to tell this weekend? What's the story we want to tell? I mean, every weekend we want to tell a story because, who doesn't love a good story? Our culture thrives on stories, and as human beings, we love stories. We just need stories. We tend to feed off of stories. Your brain, my brain is designed to engage in stories, and stories are the kind of things that make random events just kind of by themselves, they mean nothing. But you pull it together in the form of a story, and all of a sudden, it begins to make sense. And so by hearing or reading a story, that's where we learn. We learn what's worth pursuing. We learn what's not worth pursuing. We learn what's beautiful and what's not, and what's worth sacrificing for, maybe even worth dying for. And so you and I, we're storytellers. On the weekend, regardless of your role, if you have a piece in planning the weekend gathering, we're storytellers. And whether you realize it or not, in your worship gatherings, you tell a story, and this is where we mess up a lot, because what we fail to realize is the story begins way before somebody walks into the auditorium. The story actually begins when they're invited to even come to one of the gatherings, but as they pull onto the property, with every glance of the eyes, with every handshake that takes place as they're coming into the building, the lighting in the room, the music that's being played as they walk in, the smells that are taking place in the room. All those things are beginning to tell the story, and what we miss so often is we don't realize that all of that's the introduction to the story. And they're deciding during that introduction, are they going to even bother reading the rest of the story? Are they going to listen to the rest of the story? It's like picking up a book and you read a couple of chapters and you go, I don't think it's that great a book, and you put it down. And when folks come into our auditoriums every weekend, they're making decisions and saying, do I even want to listen to this story or not? And every one of us are involved in helping people listen to the story. Now, the great thing for you and me is God has already given us this incredible story to tell every weekend. When you think about it, the Bible, this amazing 66 different books, 40 different authors, written over 2,000 years' time, one single story. One story that uses history, that uses biography, that uses short story, narrative, poetry, but all together it's one story. And so you and I, every weekend, have opportunity to just say, okay, we're just going to tell a piece of God's story this weekend. And the cool thing is God's story, it talks about those two issues. What are we going to do about eternity? And what are we going to do about today? How do we live our lives today? And so for us, as we teach on the weekends, and as we prepare our story for the weekends, again, we're always saying, what's this have to do with eternity? What does this have to do with today? And as you read the Bible and open it up, you realize there's more going on than actually meets the eye, because the Bible has kind of both of those questions answered as you read the Bible. On one hand, you might have what we call the lower story of the Bible. And the lower story of the Bible just kind of talks about the here and now, just kind of the daily life experiences, the circumstances that you and I kind of go through on a daily basis. It's our goals, our fears, our responsibilities. And in the lower story, it's kind of where you and I live. It's where we make money. It's where we pay bills. It's where we get sick. We get tired. We deal with breakups. We work with conflicts. And it's just kind of where we live. And it's where the people in your church live all the time. And so as you're telling your story on the weekend, are you talking at all about their life stories, about what does this have to do with my life today? And it's in the lower story where we're saying, God, I just need wisdom. I need some direction in knowing kind of how to make these decisions, how to get through life with dignity and purpose. And the lower story is where God intervenes and he kind of gets involved in our physical lives and healing. And lower story is just kind of everyday life. But there's another story that's going on in the Bible as well. There's this other story that if you look beyond the day-to-day grind of life, there's something bigger going on. And if we'll rise above the here and now, and if we'll look beyond the daily grind, then if we look beyond the lower story, then we begin to see that God also has this upper story going on as well, where he's talking about eternity. It's just kind of life from God's perspective, and there's something bigger going on. And see, the Bible isn't just filled with thousands of individual stories. The Bible is also filled with this one grand story that God is telling, and it's the upper story. And as you begin to teach God's word from the upper story, you begin to see that God has been up to something amazing from the very beginning. He's got this vision, this big idea, and it's all good news for us, because when we begin to understand the upper story of God, then we begin to say, okay, this is how my life makes sense. This is how my life has purpose. And so your story, my story, it's the lower story, but when we begin to understand our lower stories fit into the bigger story, all of a sudden you go, oh, okay, there's something amazing going on here. And so in the lower story, God answers the question, what are you going to do about today? Upper story, God answers the question, okay, but how does this fit in to eternity? Now, Randy Frazee is a pastor at Oak Hills Church in San Antonio, Texas, and he talks about this upper-lower story, and I love the illustration that he uses. And so let me just kind of tell you his illustration. Randy says to kind of understand upper-lower story, then he says, look at the two most famous pieces of art in the world to kind of help explain what's going on in the Bible. And so to view the first painting, this first work of art, you've got to go to Paris. You've got to go to the renowned Louvre Museum, and you walk past painting after painting by some of the greatest artists that ever lived, and you climb the stairs, and you move from one cavernous room to another until you finally spot it, and you come up and you begin to see the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci, and probably the most famous painting in the world, most valuable, reported it being valued at over $700 million. At first glance, when you see the Mona Lisa, you say, well, it seems kind of small, because based on the stories we hear, we figure it's got to be 2 stories high, but this is pretty close to the actual size of the painting. And as you look at the Mona Lisa, to the untrained eye, it just kind of looks fairly ordinary at first, but then you kind of look at some of the subdued colors, the subtle shadows, the details, the moody atmosphere, the background, and it begins to grow on you. And if you continue to look, you're almost drawn to her gaze, and you might even agree with the people that say wherever you move in the room, she's always just kind of looking at you. Her eyes seem to follow you. And as a family, probably 6 or 7 years ago, we visited the Louvre Museum and got to see the Mona Lisa. What I remember then, I think I've heard it's changed since then, but then they wouldn't let you take any pictures, and so they're constantly shooing everybody out with a camera. But the longer you look at the Mona Lisa, the more you kind of want to just know what's some of the story behind her life. And as you ask questions, you begin to understand them. As Lisa was actually born June 15th, 1479, during the Italian Renaissance. Her husband was actually a silk merchant, supposedly commissioned this painting, the birth of their second child, for their home. And that's good to know, but you go, okay, but there's got to be more to her story than that. I mean, what's happening in her life, right? What's going on in her life, everyday life right now? What's that smile on her face? You know, what's that all about? And is it a smile, or is it kind of, is she amused, or just kind of what's going on? Is this deep sadness? That's the first work of art. But there's a second piece of art that you also need to see, and you'd have to catch a flight to Rome to see this. Grab a taxi, have the taxi driver take you to the Vatican, and there you move into the Sistine Chapel. And upon arriving in the Sistine Chapel, you walk into this magnificent plaza, and you see this breathtaking work of Michelangelo. And the interesting thing is, both of these works of art were painted about the same period of time, within about 10 years of each other. And yet Da Vinci isolates on one person on a small canvas. Michelangelo captures the full sweep of history. And as you take in the enormous size, just kind of the stunning mural, mesmerized by the scope, and you kind of have to lean your head way back. We also visited and saw the Sistine Chapel, and you have to lean way back to see over 300 different characters that are painted on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in this one grand epic. And the Mona Lisa and the Sistine Chapel are both astounding works of art. Mona Lisa tells about one very specific moment in time. The Sistine Chapel, on the other hand, talks about just kind of the grand scheme of time. And like the Mona Lisa, your life talks about one specific moment in time. And like the Mona Lisa, each and every person in your auditorium this coming weekend, every single weekend, their lives are just one single moment in time. And what they want, each and every person sitting in your auditorium is waiting for you to tell them, okay, in my specific story, in my moment in time, I need you to tell me how God loves me. I need you to tell me how to do life well today and in this specific moment in history. But if you look closer, you also see that, okay, your story, even though it's one specific moment, it's also part of this grand, giant, epic story of God, God's story. And so each and every person sitting in your auditorium every weekend, they also need to know that they're part of something bigger, that it isn't just this that I'm living for, that I'm a part of something bigger. I'm a part of something that God is doing, and each and every person is just waiting for you to tell them, this is how you fit in. This is how you matter in God's story. And it's the upper story. Lower story, upper story. And as you help each weekend people understand God's story, you need to direct them to the lower story and say, okay, this is how your life matters today, and this is how to do life well today. But you also need to say, but there's a bigger thing going on. It isn't just about you. There's something bigger happening, and we're somehow included in God's big idea. And one time, followers of Jesus were actually asking Jesus, how do we pray? I mean, tell us how to pray, Jesus. And so this is what Jesus told them, and you've heard this and you know this. Jesus said our prayer should begin like this. He said, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now, as you see those words, what you begin to realize is those are big picture kind of things. Those are upper story kind of words. He says, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's upper story stuff. And Jesus says, you need to see life from God's perspective, the upper story. But then he goes on and he says, give us today our daily bread and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. And that's lower story stuff. Where he says, okay, you're part of a bigger picture, but you also have life today. And I understand that, Jesus says. And so you need to eat. And he said, you need to pay the bills, and you need to ask God for help with just when you hear that little voice that's saying, go ahead, do it, it feels good, whatever you want, do it. And those are the groanings of everyday life. And we kind of cry out to God, and we say, God, I need you not just for the bigger picture, but I need you to help me in the lower story as well. And so every weekend in our churches, you and I tell a story. Every one of us are part of that story. And it doesn't matter your position, it doesn't matter your role in it, if you're doing lights, if you're doing sound, if you're cleaning up the room, well, whatever it is, you're playing a role in this, and you're helping the person decide, am I going to listen to the story or am I not? And you're helping them decide, does this story that's being told, does it even matter at all? You're the introduction, you're the conclusion, you're part of the story. And God says, man, be creative in how you tell my story. He says, I just want you to tell my story. And you can be real creative in how you do it. I'm going to give you lots of the license. I just want you to tell my story, and I want you to tell my story well. And then it's almost as though God says, when you get to heaven, you know what I want to be able to do? I want to be able to say to you, I want to say to you, God says, well done, good and faithful servant. Well done, good job. Thanks for the way you told my story. I love the way you told my story. And God gives each and every one of us that opportunity. And so you and I have this amazing, amazing privilege of being a part of telling God's story. of telling people, God says you matter today. God says what you do with your life today, it matters. It really does. But also to say, but you're part of God's bigger story as well. And so for us as a church, we've been telling our story now for over 22 years. And let me just tell you some things that we've kind of learned as we have told our story, and some things that we just value that kind of drive the way we tell our stories each weekend and kind of define how we do church and who we are as a church. So let me just give you a few things that we value as a church. And again, you have to figure out as you tell your story, what are the things that you value? What's important for you with your story? So for us, one of the first values is just cultural relevance. Cultural relevance, and the fact that the message that we've had for over 2,000 years, and that message doesn't change, but the way we tell the story, that can change. There can be creativity in the way we tell the story. The methods can change in order for it to be understood by people in our culture. And so for us as a church, change is just a big part of our culture. And we tell people as soon as you come in, this is just kind of change. You just need to expect it, understand it. We have a thing we call the newcomers class that we teach every month, and we'll have about 120 people come to the class every month. And I will tell them, if you come to me or any of our leaders 6 months from now, 12 months from now, and say, you know what, things are different, it's just changed. Then we'll say, thank you. That's exactly what we want to hear. We're not bothered by that. As a matter of fact, we would be bothered if you said it was still the same. So we just say, understand, church relevance is important. We need to be sure that we're not limiting the people that can hear our story because we're not being culturally relevant. Second value for us is just outward focused. We say, it's not about me. As I tell the story, it's not about me. And so for us, we'd say if you're already a part of the LCBC community, then you put the needs of other people outside of the church before your own. It's not about you. It's about others. And it requires a willingness to commit time, a willingness to commit money, relational energy, personal preferences towards helping us see lives changed by Christ. So outward focused. It's not about me. It's about others. Third value for us is the fact that excellence matters to God. Excellence matters to God. If you've been around a little while, then you remember Paul Harvey. And Paul Harvey used to tell lots of stories. One of the stories that Paul Harvey told was about a woman that was cleaning out her deep freeze. And as she's cleaning out her deep freeze, she comes across a turkey that's frozen at the bottom of her deep freeze. And she's able to pull this turkey out, kind of dust it off, figure out what company processed this turkey. And so she called them to find out whether or not this turkey was still edible. And so as Paul Harvey's telling the story, he said that they figured out, as they're talking on the phone with this woman, that this turkey had been in her deep freeze for about 20 years. And so the question that she was asking, is this thing still edible? Can we still eat this turkey? And they said, well, if it's never been defrosted or not, then we think it'd be fine to eat. But if it's been defrosted, we would suggest you not eat it. And so her response back to them was something to the effect of, well, I'm not sure if it's ever been defrosted or not. I mean, electricity could have gone off. I'm not sure. And so finally she says, you know what I think I'll do is I'll just take it and I'll just give it to my church. And a lot of times, that's kind of the way it comes out when we're doing stuff at church. It's just church, no big deal. Doesn't really matter. But as you read the Bible, all the way through the Bible, God's always asking for people's very best. And so, Old Testament, if you were a farmer, he said, give me the very best of your crops. If you were a shepherd, he said, give me the very best of your flock. And he was always asking for the very best. There's even a story where the people had been asked to bring their best lamb to God each year, just as a way to sacrifice, to say, God, love you, just want you to know we're committed to you, you're taking care of us. And so the people did that for a while. They took their best lamb, but after a while they said, you know what, this is kind of silly. We're taking a lamb, it's going to be sacrificed to God. Why give him the best? Why don't we give him one that's going to die anyway? We'll keep the best, he gets one, it's a win-win for all of us. And they thought it was a great idea. And you know the story. God says, you know what? Don't even bother. If you're not going to give me your very best, don't even bother. And so for us as a church, we say, you know what? As you're serving here at the church, as you're leading, we just ask you to give your very best. Now, we know we're going to mess up. We mess up all the time, and that's okay. We're not talking perfection. God's not expecting perfection, but he does expect our very best. And so very best looks different depending on the environment you're in, depending on the church you're in. Our very best looks very different now with 12, 13,000 people than it did with 150 people. And so it's not a matter of size. It's not a matter of perfection. It's just do the best with what you have. And so he said excellence matters to God. Fourth value for us is it's all about authentic relationships. We said let's just be real. No games involved, no facades. Let's just be willing to share our imperfections. So just authentic relationships. Number 5, it's not a religion, it's a relationship. And so let's make sure that we're not promoting a religion every weekend, but it is a relationship between us and God. And what an amazing thing that we can have a relationship with the God of the universe. Number 6, we said possess a winning attitude. Possess a winning attitude, and attitude is huge. And I can't tell you how important it is for those of you and those of us in this room that our attitudes are positive. And sometimes we can get so focused on the job that we're doing, and when things aren't going exactly right, the attitude can go sour real fast. And as we're standing back in the tech booth, as we're standing at the front of the auditorium ready to go on the platform or whatever position we're in, that attitude can be conveyed to so many different people in so many different ways. And so we say, just understand, you got to possess a winning attitude. And there may be times we've got to sit down and say, you know what, you're actually driving more people away from God with your attitude than you're bringing to God. And so you need to change the attitude. And if we have to have that kind of conversation, our seventh value is communicate truth with grace. We say, let's just make sure as a team, let's make sure as a church that we communicate truth with grace. And all that means is that funny thing happens in church world, because in church world, we tend to think that we all have to think the same way. We've got to think the same way about all different issues. And as soon as somebody thinks a little bit different than me or you, then all of a sudden we think there's something wrong because we're not all thinking the same way. But if you've got a relationship with just one other person, you know that even you and that one other person don't think the same way all the time. And so there's no way in a church we're always going to be able to think the same way. It's not even worth trying to do that. And so we say, it's okay if we think differently. The issue is, what do we do with those differences in our thinking? So we talk about communicate truth with grace and making sure that we don't get involved in playing the game where somebody makes me mad, and so I tell all of you what a jerk he is because of what he did, and I tell everybody else how bad he is as opposed to just going and talking to him. And so, again, in our newcomers classes, in our leadership classes, I will talk and I'll say, you know what, if you're the kind of person that has to play the game and you can't communicate truth with grace and you've got to go tell everybody else behind their back, we don't want you here. Don't need to be here. You don't need to mess up what God's doing in this environment. God's doing some real cool things, and there's nothing that'll destroy a church or a team faster than playing the game behind each other's backs. So I say, if you're going to be here, just need to understand, you need to communicate truth with grace. Eighth value for us, biblical authority. And then this is it's our source of authority and knowing what God says about life and how to do it well and how to do it with eternity. And then our ninth value, we just talk about work with one eye on eternity. Work with one eye on eternity. And we talk about this with all of our volunteers all of the time, because for us as a church, there's three things we ask of our people. We say just show up on the weekend, once a weekend in one of our gatherings. We say connect with people relationally, and then we say pick one area in the church to serve well, and then get out into the community. So we ask everybody right away to serve. For us, that's one of the fastest ways to help people grow in their relationship with God, is get them involved in serving. And so we plug them in and get them serving right away. But we also say, as you're serving, always keep one eye on eternity. Because what happens is, as you serve, you're going to be given a job. You're going to be given a specific task. And initially, that task is going to be something you think is fun. You're going to enjoy it, and that's why you sign up for that task. And initially, it'll be fun, but at some point, it's not going to be so fun. And so we say, just remember to keep one eye on eternity, that what you're doing matters for eternity. So, let's say you're the kind of person you think it'd be fun to work out in the parking lot and you'd love to direct traffic. You'd love telling people what to do and where to go. So you're working in the parking lot, and in our environment in Lancaster County, summer, spring, fall, beautiful weather, but come kind of December, for sure January, it's sleeting, it's raining, it's snowing, it's cold. People aren't doing what you're asking them to do in the parking lot anyway, and you might start thinking, why in the world did I sign up for this job of working in the parking lot? We just say, well, wait a minute, just remember, okay, the task that you have is helping people get in and out of the parking lot. But that's really not what you're doing. You're making a difference for eternity, because by helping people get in and out of the parking lot in a safe, timely manner, you're making it possible for them to come into an environment where their lives can be changed by Christ for eternity. And so it really isn't about parking cars or directing traffic. It really is about making a difference for eternity. Or let's say you say, you know, what I would love to do is just hold babies. And so you sign up to work in the nursery holding babies. And for us, we have lots and lots of babies. And along with lots and lots of babies comes lots and lots of poopy diapers. And so you sign up thinking you're going to hold babies. And it's fun the first hour that you're holding babies. But before long, you realize one of our things is every diaper's got to be changed before the kids are picked up. And so you go, there's just a lot of diapers to change. And 2 or 3 weeks in, you're thinking, you know, why in the world did I sign up for this job? And we say, well, just remember, okay, one of your jobs, it's holding babies and changing diapers, but what you're really doing is making a difference for eternity, because there's a mom, maybe a single mom, maybe a dad, who's left their baby in the nursery so their lives can be changed for eternity. And so keep one eye on eternity. Maybe you decide, for some crazy reason, that you want to work with 7th grade boys. And you say, you know what, I would love to work with 7th grade boys. So you sign up to work with 7th grade boys, and so you're taught kind of, okay, this is how to keep these boys under control, and you've got a group of 7 or 8 7th grade boys, and about 30 seconds in, you say, what in the world have I done? Now, what did I sign up for? And I would just say, okay, remember, the task that you've been given is to kind of keep these 7th grade boys quiet and somewhat under control and just unharmed or not harming others. That's the task you've been given. But you need to realize you may be the only man that some of these boys will ever know that actually loves God. And so you're making a difference for eternity. That's true if you're running lights. That's true if you're doing sound. That's true if you're doing video. Whatever it is you're doing, you're making a difference for eternity. So don't lose sight of that. And in the panic of Sunday morning, the panic of Saturday night, trying to get everything ready to go, don't lose sight of what you're doing. If you think it's just about having everything perfect in the room, you're missing the boat. That's not the business you're in. It's not to have a perfect environment in the room. The business you're in is changing lives for eternity, and so don't lose sight of eternity. Some things that we've learned over the last 22 years, just a few lessons that I would just give to you. First lesson that we talk about all the time is stay focused. Stay focused. And we talk about that. We talk about let's not do what's good, let's do what's best. Good versus best. And there's a big difference between good versus best. There's all kinds of things that people are going to come to you in your church and say, you know what, it would be good if we do this. And you have to be able to decide, okay, is that good or is it best? And if it's just good, then don't do it. You're only going to do what's best. And so, lots of good ideas, lots of good causes. Constantly you're coming your way as a church or as somebody planning for the weekend environment, but is it really going to be best? As churches, we face all the time, especially as we've grown as a church, for some reason people always want to tie politics in with church. And so in our area, we happen to be in a community that I think at the time was dry when it came to alcohol, and there was a push to make it wet where alcohol could be served. And so all the different churches and political groups came to us as a big church in town and said, would you get petitions going to make sure that the community stays dry and doesn't allow alcohol? And we had to step back and say, you know what, okay, maybe what you're asking us is good, but we don't think it's best, because the very people that we're going to say no to are the very people we're hoping to attract to our church. And if we become known as the church that's against everything, then we're not going to be able to introduce them to Jesus Christ. So we had to say no to what maybe was a good thing. Didn't make us popular with other churches, didn't make us popular with some political leaders. We had to say, okay, what's good and what's best? And I would just challenge you in your ministry areas, constantly ask the question, what's good and what's best? Number two, second thing we learned is to continually be benchmarking. Continually be benchmarking, which really means just learn from others. And for us as a church, we used to call it beg, borrow, and steal. And then I went to a business conference about 7 or 8 years ago on excellence and found out that the business world, they call it benchmarking. And that sounds a whole lot better than stealing ideas from other people. So we say, let's constantly be benchmarking. And you're kind of doing that by being here at this conference, but be learning from everybody else, which is the third thing we learned is don't stop learning. Don't stop learning. For us as a church, the very first conference that I took our leaders to, I took 4 elders, and we went to Philadelphia to the Breaking the 200 Barrier. And how do you break beyond 200 people in our church? And we still go to conferences today, and we read books, and we listen to CDs together. We watch other churches that are ahead of us, and try to learn how to be more effective. I mean, what we constantly have done is to say, okay, let's pick a church that's maybe twice our size. So when we were 200 people, we said, let's look for a church of 400 or 500 people. How do they operate at 400 or 500 people? And let's start kind of operating that way. And let's kind of, if God were to grow us to 500 people, what would that look like? And we don't want to stop what God's going to do in our church because we're not ready for it. And so we did that at 500 people. We'd say, let's look for a church of 1,000. We got to 1,000. We said, let's look for a church of 4,000 or 5,000. Now we're looking at churches of 25,000. It's like, what would that look like? And you might say, well, that's awful presumptuous to assume that God's going to take you from 200 to 500 or from 12,000, 13,000, 14,000 to 25,000. And I would say, I'm not worried about being presumptuous. What I think would be tragic is if God were kind of doing something where he would have allowed us to get to 25,000 or allowed us to get to 500, but because we weren't ready for it, we missed the opportunity. And so we constantly say, let's just be ready. And we don't know if God will take us there. And if he doesn't, that's okay. But if he does, we don't want him not to do it just because we're not ready for it. So don't stop learning. Fourth thing we learned, hire experts, not generalists. And this one, maybe it depends on church sizes, so I won't say a whole lot, other than the fact that your staff will make or break you. And so hire carefully. Number 5, people follow big dreams. People follow big dreams, so set the bar real high. And And a lot of times in churches, we're afraid to set the bar too high because we don't want to ask people to do too much or have to give too much of their effort or spend too much time around the Christmas holidays away from their family to do all of our Christmas programs, and set the bar high because they respond when you set the bar high. They want to be a part of something that's exciting. And so set the bar high. And for us as a church, the times that we've experienced the most growth have been when we've set the bar real high and said, we need big things out of you right now. Number 6, as far as things that we've learned, you can't please everyone. So stop trying. You cannot please everyone, so don't try. What I watch churches do all the time is they're so focused on keeping everybody happy that nobody's happy. And I know there's lots of different views on music styles and things, and I'll go ahead and say what I think. And I know it's not what everybody else even here thinks, but I think sometimes we try so hard to be blended and be a little bit of everything for everybody that nobody is real happy, because the people that want contemporary want more contemporary. The people that want traditional want more traditional, and so they're mad because you're doing any choruses at all, or they're mad because you're doing any hymns at all. And so you're not going to please everybody. What happens when you've got a bunch of 50-50 is it's just mush. And you say, why is nobody excited about our church? Well, there's nothing to be excited about. You're trying to please everybody, and you haven't gone to any kind of distance to please everyone. So for us, as a church, we say we would rather 90% of the people be wildly enthusiastic and 10% of the people be wildly upset with us. And that's kind of the way it works. And but I would rather that than mush, where nobody's excited and everybody's just sitting around complaining and bickering. And if you're finding yourself in a situation where there's not much excitement, and if you're finding yourself in a situation where everybody just seems to be kind of blah, then maybe you're trying too hard to please everybody. And maybe you need to pick more of a direction and go for it. And you know you're going to make people mad, but you also know you're going to have a lot of people that are real excited, and that's what's going to drive you into the future. Number 7, understanding your purpose gives you incredible freedom to say no. If you understand your purpose of what the weekend is about, or your church is about, it gives you incredible freedom to say no. If you understand that your weekend gathering is to tell a story, and it's to tell a story about how my life fits into God's bigger plan today and how to do life well today, then it gives you the ability to say no to every ministry that comes and says, would you announce this event for us in the service? Would you announce our picnic? Would you announce our gathering? Would you announce... It gives you the ability to say no because, that's great. It's good that you want people to come to your picnic, but that's not what the gathering is about. And everybody in your church thinks that the gathering is the easiest place to get the word out. And we say, maybe it is the easiest place, but you're going to have to work harder and find another way because it's not going to happen in the gathering. And so it gives you incredible freedom to say no if you understand your purpose. And then the last thing, number 8, is that vision leaks. Vision leaks, so you constantly got to reword, restate what you're saying, what you're doing. So don't assume just because you figured out a purpose statement, don't assume because you took a retreat with some leaders and you sat down and you said, here's our vision, here's our purpose, got that, put it on the shelf and walk away, that anybody's ever going to remember that. You're going to have to say it again and again, over and over and over. So vision leaks. For us as a church, again, we talk about leadership, we talk about partnership, and the leadership's part for us as a church is just provide environments where lives can be changed by Christ. That's just what we say we're about. That's our purpose, providing environments where lives can be changed by Christ. We ask our people to gather, connect, and serve in those environments. So show up on one weekend environment, connect with people relationally, serve in one environment, and then just get out into the community and love other people. Now, what I've been doing is kind of talking about us as a church, and what I realize is none of us are alike. We're not even supposed to all be alike. And so God has given your church a very unique thumbprint. God's given your church this unique design. And so you need to understand, okay, what business are you in as a church? What is God asking you to do as a church? And while there may be similarities between churches, your church ought to be unique to you and your people. And so I've been describing to you our story, but you need to figure out, okay, what's your story? And what's your purpose on the weekends? This guy by the name of Kent Hughes was a pastor in Wheaton, Illinois for many years, wrote several different books. One of the books that he wrote was a book called Disciplines of a Godly Man. And in the book, Kent talks about he and his wife, Barbara, and an experience they had one Christmas season with 2 of their children that were involved in Christmas pageants at their school. And as Kent tells the story, he says, our oldest daughter, Holly, had the lead role in the program, O. Henry's Gift to the Magi. And Holly played the part of Della. And if you know that story, Della's the one where she's got long, beautiful hair. She just doesn't have any combs to comb her long, beautiful hair. And the love of her life has this beautiful pocket watch, but he doesn't have a chain to take care of his pocket watch. And so it's this big love story. And so Della cuts her hair without him knowing to buy him a chain for his pocket watch. And he sells his pocket watch without her knowing to buy her combs for her hair. And it's just this real big, grand love story. And they said as the story was going on, Holly had her part down to a T. It said that she told the story and did her part with it. And said when the performance was over, everybody just stood and they clapped and clapped. And Kent and Barbara said, we were so proud of our daughter Holly. We were proud of her. And we said, that's our girl. But then they said it came time for their son, Kent Jr., for his part in the Christmas musical. And Kent Jr. had learning disabilities. They said he hadn't really even been able to say the alphabet till he was about 4th grade. And so it came time for him and his class to do his performance. And so they had worked for days to help Kent Jr. get his part down. And since well before Thanksgiving and on the trip home for Thanksgiving, said that they just worked all the way up, all the way back. All of their kids were able to say the lines back and forth over and over. But Kent Jr. never had said his lines right. And everybody else in the family knew these 4 lines, but he never had. So then it came time for his part in the performance. So that night he goes out on the stage to do his part, and to anybody else that was there in the audience that thought, this is just some normal, nervous kid, nothing special about him, doesn't even have a big part. So he comes out to say his lines, and he says, strange feelings come upon me, although I know not why. The night is still around me, the stars shine in the sky. That was it, his 4 lines. So nobody else in the place noticed anything. But they said his parents, we were so proud of Kent Jr. We wanted to stand and clap and say, that's my boy. We were just as proud for Kent Jr. as we were for Holly in her part and in his part. And it wasn't a matter of who had the bigger part. It wasn't even a matter of who noticed how big the part was. It's just a matter that they both had parts and they both did them well. Each of us have parts that God has given to us. Each of us have a part in telling God's story every single weekend. And it doesn't matter how big your part is. It doesn't matter how many people notice your part. God just says, I've given you a part, and I want you to do your part well. And I think just like Kent and Barbara with their son and daughter, sitting on the edge of their seats saying, that's my boy, that's my girl. I think God is looking at us and saying, that's my boy, that's my girl. They've done my part that I gave them. And it doesn't matter that anybody else noticed. It doesn't matter that anybody else applauded. It doesn't even matter how big the part is. Each of us have been given a part to tell a story on the weekend. And the question is, are we going to do our part well? And what is God in heaven saying about us? Is he saying, I loved the way you told my story? So my prayer for you, my prayer for all of us, is that each weekend we would tell our story and we would tell it well. That God in heaven would be saying, that's my boy, that's my girl. Did their part, did it well. Doesn't matter that anybody else knew they were backstage doing something. Doesn't matter that anybody else saw this or didn't see it. They just did their part and did it well. So let me pray for you, and I'll pray for myself as well, and say, God, may you be pleased with the parts that we play. Heavenly Father, you've got this amazing story that you've told throughout history, a story that involves eternity, a story that involves even just the smallest pieces of today on how to do life and how to do it well. And all of us here, guys, for whatever reason, you've given us the privilege to being parts of teams that tell your story over and over and over. Sometimes it's easy to get lost in the story and the details, and it's easy to forget that we've got this amazing opportunity to tell people about you, and that you say we matter, and that you say that we're lovely and worth loving and worth dying for. God, I ask that this coming weekend, I ask that every weekend that we have the opportunity to tell your story, that we would take our part, whatever size of part it is, whether anybody notices it or not, God, that we would tell your story and would tell it well, and that you would be in heaven saying, that's my boy, that's my girl. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.
All right. Thank you. Great stuff, David. David, do you mind if we took a couple of questions? Would that be okay? Actually, can I call you John? Are we good enough friends I can call you John? Okay, cool. Thank you. No, Dave was nice enough before. He said if you wanted to take some questions for what he shared. So if you guys have any questions, you want to raise your hand, I'll come over and give you a mic, and David can answer them. Anything about what he said, about his values, what's going on at the church, anything he shared? Questions? Yeah, right here in front. Yeah.
David, I didn't catch the very end of what was on the screen. I apologize, but you were talking about how big, or the issue not being how big or how noticeable our part is, but I didn't catch. Oh, there it is. How about that? You guys are awesome.
Tech people are wonderful. That's right. Make us look good. So.
Good. Do you need an explanation on that, or are you okay?
No, I got the explanation.
Awesome. Perfect. There you go. If you guys missed it, right up there. A couple more questions. Anything out there? Can't see. Good. That means they... Oh, right here in the back. Hold on.
You can tell me if this is an appropriate question or not to ask. You'd say you go into a weekend telling a story. What kind of process do you go through with your teams about what story to tell?
Yeah, so the question is, how do we figure out what story we're going to tell on the weekend? And we typically will do series that run anywhere from 4 to 6, max maybe 8 weeks long. I will typically decide kind of the topic of the stories, though we will pull some focus groups together and say what are some issues going on that we need to be addressing. But there's standard ones that we hit every year. And probably if you sit down and look at yours, there are too. We're going to talk about finances once every year, a small series every year. We're going to talk about relationships every year. We'll probably talk about marriage every year. We'll talk about the vision or purpose of our church every year. So there's probably half of the year that we know we're going to be addressing already. And then we'll always say, let's do a Bible book study each year, and so things like that. Then our process is, once we know those topics, then, and this has changed over the years. So early on, I was by myself, and I would start looking, what are other churches doing? How are they addressing these topics? What books could I find? Now that things have changed, then there's some people on our staff that will do that. And so we'll pull series from other churches on similar topics. We'll pull messages from other churches. We'll look at all the different programming pieces and say, were there dramas, were there videos, were there songs that we liked, things like that. And so we'll have a team of people to pull that together. So about a month before the series starts, then we'll sit down, we'll have titles for all the messages, we'll figure out what special elements are going to be there. Right now, we operate on about a 3-week in advance, knowing what's going to happen that weekend. We've gone through lots of iterations of that. The worship and arts people would like to know exactly what I'm going to say about 6 months ahead of time. And I say, well, usually by Thursday afternoon, Friday, I'll probably know what I'm going to say Saturday night. So it's just kind of a tension that you live with all the time, and so they're always wanting it more. I will say as a speaker that here's kind of the general direction I'm going, and probably most of the songs you pick or the videos you pick are going to fit in there and be 90% on par. And so go ahead and pick them, and then if we need to refine more, we can. We do 4 gatherings at our at the campus that I teach at, 2 on Saturday night, 2 on Sunday morning. So after the 4:30 gathering, then a team of 5 or 6 people get together and we critique everything and say, okay, how did that song work? How did the message go? What parts do we need to change? And if something doesn't work, there was a special that we did 2 weeks ago that they'd spent a ton of time working on, and we have 5 campuses, so if we cut things, then it gets cut on all the campuses. And so it just didn't fit right. And so we cut it, and it doesn't matter that you've been spending a lot of time working on it. You can't get your feelings hurt. Even if you wrote the song, it doesn't matter. It didn't work, so we're cutting it. And so we make decisions that way. So that's a little bit of the process. The way we do our gatherings, we benched Mark from North Point Church, but stole their ideas. We love the funnel idea of starting with an opener that's just up and happy, you're glad you're here, kind of thing. And so typically that's a secular song that we'll use. We love to use secular songs in our services, either for that happy piece or later on in the service, right before the message. Oftentimes we'll use a secular song that's going to describe angst or tension or frustration that most everybody in the church is sitting there feeling that same kind of frustration. And the problem with a lot of Christian songs is they always answer the question. And so they'll say, here's the problem, and here's the answer, and it's always Jesus. And that's true, but I don't want you to say that before I have a chance to say the message. So I love to take secular songs, and we don't always worry about who the artists are, and there's always the danger of, well, if you just played their song, do you know what the rest of that album said? And yeah, we do, but we're not saying go out and buy it, but people do. But anyway, it's one of those risks that we take. and love for them then to hear that song on the radio, and all of a sudden it's got all new meaning to them because they heard it in church with a whole different meaning, and they go, oh. And so it's one of those risks that you take, and so we do that all the time. And so we kind of narrow it down the funnel. And then at the end of the message, then typically there's always some kind of response, whether it's the whole congregation or special, something like that. So, yeah.
Good. Maybe two more right here.
My question is on logistics. I come from a small church, and I'm wondering, if you said you had 14,000, how long is it before you actually get feedback from what occurred? What I'm trying to say is, you obviously you say we a lot, and I can understand that. How often do you personally become aware of how things went?
Well, I hear instantly when the service is over because, like I said, there's a team of 5 people that come up and we critique everything. And so we used to do it closer to the side of the stage, but then you've got other people that are standing around that you didn't want them to hear what the conversation you're having, because we'll push back and forth where I'll say, but I love that point. And they'll say, but that point didn't make sense. And so we have those discussions. So we've gone from the edge of the stage to way back behind the drum set now to have those conversations. And so I get feedback right away from them. I will also tell you that one of the biggest feedbacks for me is Ruth, my wife, and she comes to all 4 gatherings, her choice, not that I ask her to. But I love to hear her feedback. And so after I listen to everybody else's feedback, then I look for Ruth and say, tell me how it went, and she can give me some real quick feedback, and she's always very gracious to me. She knows if she needs to say something hard, say it nicely, and then sometimes she knows maybe it wasn't that great, but I just need to tell you it's good because otherwise you're going to be crushed. So she's kind to me. But anyway, so I'm looking for feedback all the time. So I hear it pretty quickly from our staff and things, and then we get emails and stuff from other people right away too.
Good question. Maybe one more out there. Oh, right here.
I'm wondering, you talked about the different barriers, when you hit 200 and 400, and which was the most difficult to overcome?
The question was, what's the most difficult barrier? It's probably the one you're facing, because they're hard at every stage. So you just have to change the way you operate and change the way you think with every stage. And if you think, see, what I watch churches do all the time is they'll spend several years figuring out their organizational structure, and now we've got it figured out. And the problem is, if you stay with that organizational structure for very long, then you're going to be limited to whatever size that structure fits. So you constantly have to be adapting and changing. And so I always tell our guys, we're not going to spend 6 months figuring this out. We'll figure it out kind of on the fly, because a lot of times, too, people will say, before we do anything else, let's figure this out. And if you wait and do that, you've lost your momentum. So you've got to figure it out while you're on the fly, and again, learning from other churches that are ahead of you. So you're not doing it in stupidity and ignorance. You're saying, here's what other people that are doing well are doing, so let's figure that out. You've got to be careful that you don't try to adopt structures that are too far ahead of you. If you're a church of 200, then you don't go to a church of 2,000 and say, how do we structure ourselves? Because it's not even the same animal. Carl George is a guy that, I think he's still around, but a church growth expert, and he would always talk about churches as different animals. And we tend to think church is church and all churches are the same, but he'd say, no, it's a matter of different animals. And so a church of 75, which he says is the average size church in America, then he might describe that as a mouse, but then the next size up is a cat, and a mouse and a cat are two very different things. And then he says the next size up for that, I think he used a dog, and then all the way up to dinosaurs. But you've got all these different types of animals, and his point is, it's not the same animal that just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's a whole different animal. And so every time you come up on one of those barriers, you've got to say, okay, we can't be a cat anymore. If we're going to keep growing, we've got to figure out what's it take to be a dog, and let's operate and function like a dog. And so very different, but whatever stage or barrier you're up against, that's the hardest one. It's when you start getting satisfied and thinking, okay, we're done. In our community, the largest churches that had ever been in our community had grown to about 3,000. And so we had just always figured, okay, maybe that's as big as a church could ever get in our community. So the danger we faced as we started getting close to 3,000 was, okay, well, maybe we've reached kind of the limit. And so you've got to be willing to say, it sounds absurd. For us right now, we're talking about what would it look like to be a church of 25,000. And that's totally absurd. And as we talk about that, it takes us 30 minutes to all sit there and go, this is even stupid to be doing this. What are the odds of that happening? But we still got to say, but let's not stop ourselves just because we couldn't think big enough, because God can think bigger than we can think. And so let's go ahead and think bigger than what seems natural to us and move ahead.